talk about something you've been taught maybe 20 years ago, which is how to make a baby. And I'm going to talk about how a lot of things that you learned 20 years ago may be wrong, okay, about how to make a baby. The reason is that we keep trying to make a baby having sex, and this is what happens to people who try to make a baby having sex. So this year, 7 million people will try to conceive through sex. And only 5 million people will actually succeed and get pregnant, but of those, 1 million people will miscarry. And then 4 million people will have babies, but of those, 200,000 babies will be born with preventable congenital illnesses, health problems, let's say. So the objective of having a baby, obviously, is to have a healthy baby, a baby who will lead a full life with a life expectancy way over the 80 years that you have now. So while we're changing a lot of things in our lives, we still haven't changed the way whatever we think works to make a baby. And so as a result, we have a huge infertility epidemic. And we have an infertility epidemic in the US, we have an infertility epidemic in Europe. Maybe 20 years ago, we were really worried about the world becoming overpopulated, and now we'll go from 7 billion to 9 billion, and then boom, we're going to collapse. Infertility is rising everywhere in the world, and even in the US, a 2.1 rate is what you need for population to stay the same, and we have fallen below replenishment rate. And so last year, the women who turned 45, which is the age at the last age where women are believed to possibly can have a child having sex, around 1 in 5 never had a child. And of those, only 4% of women never wanted to have a child. Because, of course, if you never want to have a child, you should never have a child, right? But we're talking about the 96% of women who would have liked to have a child. But then you see that 20% had no children and 18% only had one child. But when you ask women under 30 how many children you would like to have, they say they would like to have 2.7 or close to 3 or 3. Nobody actually wants to have 2.7 children. But it's an incredible failure, right? And it's a failure rate at something that we arguably is the most important thing in our lives. I mean, it's certainly in my life. I have 6 children and I have a 7th coming. So it is the most important thing in my life. But I think it's the most important thing in many people's lives. So I'm a tech entrepreneur who's built, 6 technology companies, and each technology company was trying to solve some problem that people had. My last company, Phone, built the largest Wi-Fi network in the world, and it helped people to connect to Wi-Fi, right, which is important. But I think having children is the most important challenge of most people's lives. And what I'm going to talk about is how to make babies in a way that is better than just having sex to make a baby. Or you could say that sex is great, but sometimes it's not great to make babies. Because the main reason why sex is not great to make babies anymore is because we have them late. We were designed to have babies as teenagers and in our early 20s. But we used to have them at that age. Like in the 70s, by the age of 35, women had 3 babies on the average, and now they have 1 baby. And so we pushed ourselves into an infertility boundary. When people lived until they were 45, it kind of makes sense to have your babies at 17. But now we live at over 80, but we're still forced to have babies in that window. And that's a window in which women are building their careers, men are building their careers, and we have a social incompatibility. Our bodies are not in sync with our lives. And this is what we're trying to address at Prelude. Because fertility drops drastically during the 30s. And we as animals are not great at procreation. It's very interesting. We're not even great when we are in our 20s. But in our 20s, many times the men is the main reason for infertility. In the 30s and the 40s, most of the time is the women. And so one thing that people don't know is that women in their 50s and 60s can have babies. I'm not recommending it. I'm not saying that you should wait until your 60s to have a baby. But in countries where surrogacy is not allowed for pay, sometimes mothers offer themselves as surrogates for their daughters. There's no issue about women having babies at the same age as men, except because of their eggs, not their womb. And this stat just shows that when women use donor eggs, when women in their 20s give eggs to women in their 40s and 50s, they get pregnant at the same rate. They get pregnant at 50, 60% on the first try. So it's really mostly, almost all about the eggs and not about the age of the women. And also because people have babies late in life, the chances of having a healthy baby decrease with age. So it's not only that having a baby at all, but it's having a healthy baby that gets worse with age. There's more chromosomal abnormalities. And there's also men are different contributors to risk. Like men in their 20s have half the risk of having children with severe mental illness as men in their 40s and 50s. So men and women are contributors to health risk if they get to have a baby at all. So this has resulted in a boom of the IVF industry. Like people go to IVF clinics to have babies and they have babies with IVF. And right now, more than 1.5% of babies are born with IVF. But the sad thing is not only a third of the people who have sex to make a baby fail, but a third of the people who pay their life savings to an IVF clinic also fail because they show up when it's too late. So you either fail having sex or you either fail during IVF. And when we were confronted with this failure, my wife and I, when she was 31 and she was already infertile, I became, as a tech entrepreneur, I was also a pre-med student, but a failed doctor, but I still had this desire to be a doctor. I started studying very carefully what could we do to bridge this gap between the third of the people who fail having babies having sex, the third of the people who failed in IVF. What would we do to bridge the gap? And I came up with this Prelude method, which is a way to have healthy babies at any age, or any age where you would want to have them. And it's a way to make it much more likely to have healthy babies, to increase the chances of having as many children as you would like to have, maybe from 60% to maybe over 90%. So the Prelude method involves 4 steps. And this is the method that I say that is better than sex to make a baby, especially if you're going to make a baby in your 30s and 40s. Because if we stuck to the area that biology defined for us, we wouldn't need the Prelude method. The Prelude method basically involves freezing sperm and eggs when you are fertile. And with the person you're with or without the person you're with. Like you could be in a relationship or not in a relationship. And there's some of that going on now. There's some egg freezing going on now. There's no sperm freezing going on now, which we believe is a big mistake. And the egg freezing that's going on now happens when it's too late, because if you're 39 freezing eggs, it may or may not work. You're at the age in which you're aging infertility, so you're freezing your fertility or you're freezing your infertility. So we believe that people should freeze their egg and sperm when they're young, when they're fertile. Exactly what that is depends on some parameters, but let's say before the age of 35. Then they should make embryos when they're ready to make a baby. They make embryos. And then they genetically sequence themselves and the embryos and transfer one embryo at a time. Now, one embryo at a time to avoid having multiple births, which is multiple pregnancies, which is common associated with IVF. Now, of course, the women carry the babies. And of course, you'll get pregnant. But this is a kind of pregnancy that you can announce the week after. Now, people don't say they're pregnant. They don't say they're pregnant because they fear they may abort. They fear they may miscarry. But the chances of miscarrying when you've done genetic screening of embryos and your embryos are chromosomally normal are much lower than when you just get pregnant having sex. So this method fights infertility, fights congenital illness, fights miscarriages, and fights clinical abortions that are done because right now people are having sex, mostly, to make babies, but then they use an IPT or a certain type of genetic testing that is done on women while they're pregnant, and many times it's pretty sad, and they're told the sad news that their baby is having a serious problem, and they choose to abort. So the Prelude method fights these four things. Now, the first sexual revolution involved the pill, right? And people decoupled sex from procreation. And what we're saying is Prelude is the second sexual revolution, where procreation becomes decoupled from sex. We're not saying that people shouldn't have sex to make babies at all. As I said, if you're in your 20s or if you're pregnant already and you had sex, you wouldn't go and have an abortion just because you didn't do Prelude. By then you would do genetic testing and see that everything is fine and you would have the baby. But what we're saying is that you cannot just rely on sex to make babies, because you have basically a third of the chance that you'll never reach your objectives to become a parent. And we call that the second sexual revolution. Now, we are saying that women, men who plan to become mothers and fathers in their 30s and 40s should do the Prelude method. The Prelude method wouldn't have been possible as recently as 8 years ago because there's two technologies that made it possible: genetic sequencing of embryos and vitrification, which is what allows to reliably freeze eggs. You can, of course, also freeze embryos, but many people get divorced. And when you freeze an embryo, you freeze your marriage. And when you freeze eggs, you freeze optionality as a woman, because men rebuild their life in their 40s and have babies at 3 times the rate as women in their 40s. Because all those people wanted to have babies in their 40s, but men can. As a father of 3 boys and 3 girls, I want the same opportunity for them. I want my girls not to have a gun on their head to think if I don't get married, my career. I want boys and girls to have the same opportunities. And I think you shouldn't freeze embryos because you're freezing a marriage that unfortunately may not last. Another reason not to freeze embryos is because genetic testing gets better every year. We detect more and more illnesses every year. If you freeze embryos, test embryos, you cannot make embryos again. Let's say 7 years later, you have no eggs left. You don't have eggs anymore. It's better to sequence them when you're going to use them because science will have gone further. And men should freeze their sperm. There's a study that was done with 2.6 million people in Scandinavia that shows that men in their 40s have a much greater chance of having children with mental illness than men in their 20s. The women were always in their 20s, so they looked at women in their 20s who have babies with men in their 40s and women in their 20s who have babies with men in their 20s. Now, the thing is that freezing sperm is much easier than freezing eggs. Sperm lasts 6 hours at room temperature, and producing a specimen is pretty pleasurable. You could even have an Uber system where they come and pick it up. You don't have to embarrass yourself in a clinic as I did to have my first prelude baby that's coming. You can do it in the privacy of your home. Somebody collects the specimen, 6 hours at room temperature, your sperm is frozen, you're set to go. I would certainly do that if I was a man in my 20s, and I did that myself in order to have my last child 6 years ago when I became aware of these. And so what can you test in babies? And let me just say one thing now, which is very important. Prelude is not about making better looking babies. It's not about making smarter babies. It's not about making designer babies. It's just about making healthy babies, which is what people want. In my book, all babies are cute. I mean, I don't know. I'm not into this concept of making designer babies. I'm just into having healthy babies. So the babies have two kinds of problems: chromosomal abnormalities, genetic problems, and all these can be tested by PGS and PGDs, which are these techniques. And so, presently, you have two groups of people: the ones who have sex and failed a third of the time, and the ones who show up at an infertility and fail a third of the time. And what Prelude wants to do is to bridge the gap. You start when you're young, and you have healthy babies when you're ready. That's what Prelude is about. Thank you.
All right.